Hello, my name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report. As you know, the point of the show is to hold police accountable, a task which only seems to become more difficult as examples of police overreach continue to unfold across the country. It's also a task that requires going beyond examples of individual bad behavior and delving into some of the systemic issues that make bad policing possible. And let's be clear, it's through this process we evince many truisms, not just about law enforcement, but about the psyche of a country addicted to its spoils. And today we have some breaking developments, courtesy of Real News reporter Steve Horn, regarding a topic we discuss often on the show: the culture of policing. What Steve has learned occurred in a city that has been under a national spotlight for a controversial police shooting. I'm talking about Kenosha, Wisconsin. As we all know, Kenosha police shot Jacob Blake 7 times. The police department downplayed the use of force until this video surfaced. Just a warning, what you are about to see is disturbing. And remember, this shooting occurred in front of Mr. Blake's children. Since the shooting, protests have rocked the city, some of which have turned violent. 2 weeks ago, Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed 2 people and gravely injured another. Meanwhile, the shooting has once again called attention to questionable use of police force, and more specifically, why so many encounters with cops in this country turn violent and deadly. And today, we might have an answer. That's because, as we explained before on the show, the reason American policing is so violent and so intrusive often has little to do with enforcing the law. Remember, American police arrest roughly 10 million people a year. We incarcerate roughly 25% of the world's prisoners, and our cops kill more people per capita than almost any other country on earth, which is why we search for reasons beneath the surface that explain these troubling trends. And today, we're going to report on a hidden connection between religion and policing that our colleague Steve Horn has uncovered, and that might explain some of the aforementioned problems American policing has with abusing its authority. To explain what we are about to discuss, listen to this radio host discuss the link between police authority and the Bible verse Romans 13.
As we think in terms of the gentleman who at this moment is trying to heal from the incident that took place involving his could have been a horrible situation, but I'm reminded of Romans chapter 13, verse 1 through 4, and I'd like to read that at this moment. The Bible says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God." And then the Bible says, "The power that be are ordained of God." This speaks in terms of law enforcement, those who are put in positions to protect us. And the Bible further states, "Whosoever therefore resists the power or resists law enforcement resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation," or the results in this particular case would be force to control them.
And to help me explain it, Steve is joining me now. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Good to be on PAR. Really a big fan.
So first, you've done some digging in Kenosha and found an intriguing communication between the police department and, of all things, a church. Can you talk about that?
The reason I found out about this story was I was active in a Facebook group, and in that group they were kind of, it's called Recover Kenosha, and in the recovery efforts they raised money. Then some questions were raised. Well, why are you framing this as if it's a hurricane or a natural disaster when it was a police shooting? The question came up and kind of conversations got shut down. The ultimate determination was, okay, we're going to donate this money to a charity by the name of One Hope. And then that got me asking the question, what is One Hope? It turns out that One Hope is connected to this church in question, which is called the Journey Group. The Journey Group's national banner group is the Assemblies of God USA. They espouse this ideology of Romans 13, which seems to justify that it's okay if law enforcement commits violence because they're doing so in the name of God. So that kind of got me down this track of exploring the connection between the church, the nonprofit, and the police shooting itself in Kenosha.
Now, you also found a link between this theology and the officer who shot Blake. Blake. He cited a verse from Romans. What is it, and what's the significance of the verse?
Before he took down his social media posts, the officer, Rustin Chesky, on his, of all things, his Pinterest page, which most people wouldn't necessarily look to for people's social media appearance, but on his page there was a lot of pro law enforcement, you could call it propaganda or jokes or different things that pertain to law enforcement. But one of the things he posted, it wasn't clear what the date was. I'm not sure if Pinterest works that way or not, where the actual date is stamped. But on the page there is this verse, Romans 13, I guess it would be verse 4, which is very common among law enforcement, not only in Kenosha, but nationally in sheriff's departments and different police departments. And long story short, this is something that he felt strongly enough about the verse, which basically says that law enforcement has the will of God, if you do not follow the law, to basically impose God's wrath. That's the paraphrase of the verse. So that's on his Pinterest page. That is just something interesting that was in his personal ideology that he felt strongly enough to post on his Pinterest.
So, Steve, you've spoken to the church and asked them for comment. What did they say?
And well, the church basically said that we do not believe that this is something that should be taken in of itself. We don't believe that this verse should be used to justify police violence. They pointed to other verses that talked about, I believe, like mercy and other types of kind of more universal things that didn't have to do with imposing the wrath of God. So they distanced themselves from it. And I should clarify, this particular church, there's nothing on their website that says we believe that Romans 13 is this guideline thing. But the important connection here is that the national church does believe it, and the national church, I also got a comment from, basically deferred to the local. But importantly, the connection between the Kenosha Police Department and this church is very direct. It's that the chaplain of the Kenosha Police Department is actually also a pastor at the Journey Church. And so regardless, I mean, I think that I heard from a source that basically this is a fundamental guide, kind of a guiding verse. It is discussed at many police gatherings, like funerals or different kind of ceremonies. It's very commonly referred to and referenced within the Kenosha Police Department.
Steve, do you think this theology authority is connected to other law enforcement organizations throughout the country?
It absolutely is something that goes throughout the state of Wisconsin and nationally. So in looking into this further, I learned that about a decade ago, the very controversial sheriff David Clark in Milwaukee County, he was basically brought in this ideology after going to a conference into his sheriff's department, and they have a whole track record of police misconduct within the Milwaukee County Sheriffs. So it extends throughout Wisconsin in one of the most controversially policed areas in Milwaukee County, but also nationally. So I found examples where, for example, sheriffs or police would have decals of Romans 13 on the back of their cars, or would have the actual Romans 13 on the logo. It kind of goes on and on. There's sheriffs who had their actual profile picture on Facebook would have Romans 13. So it kind of shows that, whether it's in the Midwest or the South, in particular the South, I'll say, there are a bounty of examples of how Romans 13 and this religious ideology has become imbued in policing in the United States.
Thanks, Steve. Now, the implications of this so-called theology of policing is not limited to the case of Jacob Blake. 2 weeks ago, we also reported on another tragic police shooting that occurred in 2004. I'm talking about the killing of 21-year-old Michael Bell Jr., who was shot and killed after he was accosted by police outside his home in 2004. As you can see on the dash camera video we're showing now, Bell was exiting his vehicle when a police officer detained him and accused him of running a stop sign. Less than a minute later, an officer shot him in the head in front of his family and killed him. His father, Michael Bell Sr., has pursued justice for his son ever since. He fought for and won reform that prevented police in Wisconsin from investigating themselves after they used deadly force. One of the key people who helped Mr. Bell is a former Kenosha detective, Russ Beckman. He assisted the Bell family by investigating the shooting himself. During that probe, he determined the officer's excuse that Bell Jr. had reached for an officer's gun was improbable. And today he is joining us. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
First, I know you've talked candidly about the problems inside the Kenosha Police Department. What are your misgivings, and how do you think they affect the department's relationship with the community?
I think the Kenosha Police Department has a problem connecting with the community that actually goes back decades. And it's one of those things, this unfortunate circumstance where Jacob Blake was shot has kind of brought this all out. It's exposed the what's under all the rocks in Kenosha. And not just Kenosha, but law enforcement throughout the country needs to rebuild the relationships with the communities that it serves. It's not doing a very good job at that. I think that after September 11th attacks, when police officers were the ultimate heroes in our society, that kind of grew on them, and they lost their ability to have humility, and they have to recognize that they serve the public, that they're not warriors for in our society. And law enforcement needs to get back to providing customer service and doing what's right for the people.
So tell us a little bit about Roman 13's ideological entrance into the Kenosha police culture. When and how did it happen?
I think it's Kenosha has paralleled probably other law enforcement agencies in our country. I started out as a Kenosha police officer in the early 1980s, and I grew into the culture just like any other young rookie police officer. And about the late 80s to early 90s, there was a police chaplain program that started in Kenosha, as it did with other police departments, all over. Kenosha is no different in terms of that. It's very typical as far as law enforcement goes. And this Romans 13, that's when I was introduced to. In fact, I actually did a reading of Romans 13 at one of the first law enforcement memorial services that we have in the spring. And it was just something that I noticed as it became better known, it kind of integrated itself into the culture of law enforcement. If you go to any police wedding, funeral, memorial service, or spiritual gathering, you will find that Romans 13 is on the reading list. It is something that is actually read. It is part of the culture of law enforcement in Kenosha and probably in other law enforcement agencies.
So why does it matter that so many Kenosha police officers espouse Romans 13 as an ideology? What is the risk that it poses to democracy and society?
As any person who's entering the law enforcement profession, you learn the ways and the means and the norms of that culture as you grow into the culture. So I first became aware of it as I matured as a younger police officer in the late 80s, but I have no doubt that it existed long before that.
Do many people believe in the ideology, even if they're not deeply religious? That is it more of a religious belief, or is it a slogan allowing misconduct?
Well, I got just a text of Roman 13 here. I mean, if you're a police officer, you are a government employee. You don't work for any spiritual being. You don't work for God, no matter what God you worship. You work for the government, and you are accountable to the people. And the rules that you enforce are not the spiritual rules, not the rules and the norms that are in the Bible. It is the rules of the government and ultimately the Constitution. If police officers are going to worship anything, it should be the Constitution and not the words of the Lord. And it's not that I'm hostile to religion, but police officers serve everyone. And that's people of all faiths and people of no faiths. And they can't impose their fundamentalist perspective on others and have it affect their judgment in law enforcement. If you read the words of Romans 13, just one small part of it, for he, and that's referring to law enforcement, the literal interpretation of this, is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out the God's wrath on the wrongdoer. First of all, our system of government does not allow for police officers to cast judgment on criminal suspects. That's the jobs of the courts. Police officers' jobs are simply to gather evidence, provide accurate and truthful testimony, and to have that person enter the criminal justice system. They are not the judge, the jury, and I know it sounds crude, the executioner, okay? And this Romans 13, the literal interpretation, many police officers feel that they are doing God's work on earth. And no, they're not. They're doing the government's work on earth.
Do you have faith that the system has been reformed now since Mr. Bell's work to get an independent investigator? Do you think they can render an impartial judgment of what happened?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the areas where I believe there are efforts to reform the law has fallen short. But we have not stopped in 2014. We've been continuing to push this process and to make the reforms that were enacted even tougher. And that is a huge problem, that a local prosecutor with deep ties to law enforcement community will be the one to make the decision up or down whether it's not as prosecuted. And specifically in Kenosha, I don't want to wholesale condemn the current district attorney, Michael Gravely, but we have a large mass of information that leads us to believe that he is not as ethical as what he should be. Now, and I stress the word believe, and the evidence leads us to believe that. Now, at some point, that evidence and all that information we have will be released. It is being shared now with certain investigative journalists. It's being shared with certain government officials that outrank Mr. Gravely. So that, I'm sure in the future, will all come to light and people can make their own judgment. But yes, we are very concerned about that Mr. Blake will not get justice with the current district attorney of Kenosha County making the decision. And we have been urging him to recuse himself from this case. And we'll see if that happens. He's been adamant about not doing that. But we're hoping that enough public pressure will come and enough information will come out that we've developed and other people have developed, where he will be forced into making that decision.
It's clear from what we've learned today that the crisis facing American policing is not just a matter of law enforcement gone awry. That is, there is something more entrenched and less visible driving cops to take such a jaundiced view of the lives of the people they purport to serve. I think it's instructive to unpack not just the words of the Romans 13 passage, but the underlying psychology, because it's clear that the implications of these simple sentences may reveal a troubling symptom of the imbalance we witness here between preserving authority and preserving life. That's because the divine admonition to obey authority allows little room for questioning. That is, when the word of God and the word of cops are fused, we can see why so many people in law enforcement might escalate the use of force when a person questions their enforcement of the law. I mean, the laws of this country aren't the result of divine providence. They are created by people, flawed people, which is why we have a constitutional right to protest them, question their origin, and change them if necessary. But the infusion of policing, divinity, and lethal force creates a dangerous liaison between authority and absolutism, a troubling intersection between the wrath of God and the power of the badge. It's something that our founding fathers actually inveighed against by making it unconstitutional to combine religion and governance. Considering how powerful and ubiquitous and often unconstitutional American policing is, it's not surprising that its adherents would seek an authority outside of the law to justify overreaching, that the power to shoot someone during a routine traffic accident would need a higher, unseen, biblical authority to create the imperative for it to happen at all. I'm sure, just like us, you can see the danger of this troubling symbiosis, an alliance between religion and state authority that this country was designed to avoid. Perhaps it reveals just how extreme our addiction to policing really is, how unnatural and antithetical to democracy locking up millions of people and shooting and killing unarmed citizens may be. It's a telling reveal about the psychology of law enforcement and a connection that explains its most problematic extremes. Now, the question is, given that we know it exists, what are we going to do about it? I would like to thank Real News reporter Steve Horn for his investigative reporting on this piece. Thank you so much, Steve.
It's great to be on. Thanks. I'm glad to contribute.
And I would like to thank Detective Russ Beckman for his time and being so forthright about his experiences. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for taking the time and spending it with me.
And I have to thank intrepid journalist Stephen Janis for his reporting, writing, and editing on this piece. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention friend of the show, Noli D. Thanks, Noli D. And I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct or brutality, please share it with us and we might be able to investigate. Please reach out to us. You can email us tips privately at par@therealnews.com and share your evidence of police misconduct. You can message us at Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram, or at Eyes on Police on Twitter. And of course, you can message me directly at Tejas Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. And please like, share, and comment. It really does help. And of course, I do read your comments and appreciate them, and I try to answer your questions whenever I can. My name is Taya Graham, and I am your host of the Police Accountability Report. Please be safe out there.